In the farthest corners of an uncharted land, where maps fade into emptiness and mountains vanish behind a curtain of white mist, there lies a valley that the old wanderers once called Elysara. Few have ever claimed to see it, and fewer still have returned to speak of what they found. They say the valley sleeps beneath a sky that never changes color, neither dawn nor dusk, only a slow, silvery light that hums through the clouds like the last breath of twilight. The air there is so still that even the smallest leaf could fall and drift forever before touching the ground. There are no birds, no waves, no echoes. Only the soft rustle of mist brushing against the stone hills, as if the land itself is breathing in its sleep. Somewhere beyond those hills, beyond forests that have never known an axe or a path, lie the ruins of a city that time forgot. Marble towers veiled in fog, bridges that lead nowhere, and pillars carved with symbols no scholar has ever translated. The first mention of Elysara appeared in the journals of an unnamed traveler, a sailor perhaps, who wrote of a silent kingdom that hums without sound. His words were found in a water-damaged book buried beneath centuries of dust in a monastery library. The ink had faded, the pages had crumbled, yet one phrase remained clear: where silence is not absence, but presence. That was all. No map, no date, no clue of who the writer was. Yet from that one sentence, generations of scholars became obsessed. Some called it myth, others believed it a metaphor for death. But a few, the dreamers and the lost, believed it was real. The land of the veiled valleys. If you were to stand at the edge of that unknown continent, though no sailor could tell you which one, you would find yourself surrounded by rolling fog that clings to the skin like memory. It isn't cold nor warm, it simply is. Every sound you make, the crunch of gravel, the sigh of breath, dissolves before reaching your ears. Even your heartbeat seems to hush, as if the valley itself demands quiet. Locals who live near the coast whisper strange tales. They speak of hearing low tones drifting from the fog, not like music, but like a single note stretching across time. They say it's not dangerous, only endless. A few brave ones, often wanderers or hermits seeking solitude, have ventured into the mist. They never came back unchanged. When they returned, if they returned, they spoke slowly, softly, as though afraid their words might break the air around them. One man, a fisherman from the northern villages, said that while lost in the fog, he saw figures walking in the distance, pale, graceful shapes moving in rhythm with one another, yet making no sound. They didn't look at him, they didn't speak, but he swore that when one of them turned her head, he heard, not with his ears, but deep inside his mind, a voice that whispered, "Be still." He ran home that night trembling, and from that day on, he never spoke above a whisper again. If you were to stand at the edge of that unknown continent, though no sailor could tell you which one, you would find yourself surrounded by rolling fog that clings to the skin like memory. It isn't cold nor warm, it simply is. Every sound you make, the crunch of gravel, the sigh of breath, dissolves before reaching your ears. Even your heartbeat seems to hush, as if the valley itself demands quiet. Locals who live near the coast whisper strange tales. They speak of hearing low tones drifting from the fog, not like music, but like a single note stretching across time. They say it's not dangerous, only endless. A few brave ones, often wanderers or hermits seeking solitude, have ventured into the mist. They never came back unchanged. When they returned, if they returned, they spoke slowly, softly, as though afraid their words might break the air around them. One man, a fisherman from the northern villages, said that while lost in the fog, he saw figures walking in the distance. Pale, graceful shapes, moving in rhythm with one another, yet making no sound. They didn't look at him, they didn't speak, but he swore that when one of them turned her head, he heard, not with his ears, but deep inside his mind, a voice that whispered, "Be still." He ran home that night trembling, and from that day on, he never spoke above a whisper again. Elysara, they say, was once a kingdom built not on gold or conquest, but on stillness. Its people believed that every sound was a wound upon the world, that noise tore at the delicate fabric of existence. To live in peace, they chose silence, and through silence, they found power. The elders of the valley taught that silence was the purest form of speech, the space where truth hides when words fail. Children grew up learning to communicate through gesture and gaze, through movement and breath. They could speak with their eyes, argue with their hands, and sing without a voice. Their temples, carved deep into the white cliffs, were designed to hold echoes like sacred relics. When a traveler entered one of those halls, even a single footstep could linger for minutes, soft, shimmering, folding over itself like a prayer. The priests of Elysara believed that in that echo lived the soul of the land itself. Over time, their silence became a form of art. They built towers that caught the morning mist and made it shimmer. They shaped rivers to flow so quietly that the water appeared still. And in their gardens, they planted trees that moved only when the stars aligned, their leaves trembling in harmony with invisible tides. The forgotten travelers. The first explorers who heard tales of Elysara dismissed them as myth, a bedtime story told by fishermen and monks. But in the late centuries of exploration, a small group of scholars from the coastal kingdoms set out to find the truth. They followed fragments of ancient charts, strange carvings, and references in half-lost languages. Their expedition vanished after crossing a fog-bound ridge. Months later, a single journal washed ashore. Its pages were warped and stained with salt. The final entry read, "We have found the valley. The air here is heavy, yet beautiful. My companions have stopped speaking. I think I understand why." No further pages were ever found. The echoing dreams. Centuries passed, the legend of Elysara faded into folklore. But sometimes, in quiet moments, the name returns. Travelers claim to dream of white cities floating above mist, of marble arches glimmering in moonlight, of rivers that whisper like voices half remembered. Some say the dreams are invitations. Others say they are warnings. It is believed that those who dream of Elysara will one day hear a call, a faint sound, softer than breath, drawing them toward the forgotten valley. Once they go, they never come back. Not because they are lost, but because they have found something worth staying for. The Last Letter. There exists, in the archives of an old monastery, a letter written by a monk who claimed to have seen Elysara with his own eyes. His name has been erased from records, either by time or by choice, but his letter remains. He wrote, "In the third night of my wandering, the fog grew bright, not with fire nor with moon, but with something gentler, as if the air itself remembered light. I saw shapes, tall, graceful, moving along a bridge of glass. They carried no torches, no tools, no weapons. They moved as though the world around them obeyed their thoughts. And though I heard nothing, I understood them. They were asking me to listen, and so I did. I listened, and the silence spoke." The monk never explained what the silence said. After writing those words, he left his monastery and disappeared. Some say he returned to Elysara. Others believe he simply fell asleep and never woke. The mist that never lifts. Even now, the fog that hides the valley is said to drift across oceans. Sailors on quiet nights sometimes see it, a slow-moving wall of silver mist, glowing faintly from within. They say that if you sail into it, your ship grows weightless, your compass spins, and all sound vanishes. You can scream and no one will hear you. You can drop a coin and it will never hit the deck. And then, just as suddenly, the fog releases you. When you emerge, the sea is calm, the stars are strange, and hours or years have passed. The Eternal Watchers. Legends speak of figures standing upon the cliffs watching the mist. Tall, silent, unmoving. They wear robes the color of pale stone and hold lanterns that never burn. Some say these are the last sentinels of Elysara, keeping the world at a distance. Others believe they are echoes, not people, but memories carved into the air. If you ever look closely, the old stories warn, one of them might look back. And if they do, you'll never forget their eyes, not because of what they show, but because of what they take. The whisper that remains. Every legend leaves behind a trace, a sound, a story, a scent. For Elysara, that trace is silence. When you stand in a field at dawn and the world is perfectly still, no birds, no wind, no hum of life, some say that is Elysara brushing against the edge of your reality. It's not a threat, it's an invitation to listen, to remember, to be still. And so begins the story of the Silent Kingdom, a land where time sleeps and sound has meaning beyond speech. A kingdom waiting, even now, beneath the veils of mist, waiting for someone who will hear what silence has to say. A story told in stillness and light. A faint ambient hum, a low tone of wind and water. They say the silence of Elysara was not born from fear. It was chosen. Long before the first empires carved their banners into stone, before kings and priests divided the earth, there existed a small valley hidden by the breath of mountains. A place where the wind didn't wander, and the river spoke in whispers too soft for mortal ears. In that valley, a people lived who had never known war, not because they lacked strength, but because they had never learned the noise of anger. Their history began not with conquest, but with a vow that no word would ever break the peace of the world again. The birth of stillness. No one knows who first uttered the vow. Some say it was an oracle who heard the sky cry out after the birth of thunder. Others say it was a king weary of the endless voices of his court. But the most ancient tales say it was a child, a little girl born beneath a crescent moon, whose first breath came without sound. When her mother heard no cry, she feared the child was gone. But the midwives saw the child's eyes, open, clear, shining like still water. And they said the silence was not death, it was peace. They named her Elira, and from her name the valley took its own, Elysara, the land that breathes without sound. From that moment on, the people chose to live in quiet. They discovered that stillness brought clarity, that in the absence of noise, they could hear the heartbeat of the earth itself. They could sense one another's thoughts, not as words, but as feelings, soft waves of emotion that passed from soul to soul like ripples across a sleeping lake. The language of thought. The Elysarans developed a language unlike any other, one of movement, of gaze, of shared memory. A hand raised slightly could mean a greeting. A slow exhale could mean farewell. A touch over the heart could carry gratitude deeper than any spoken thanks. Children learned early how to listen without ears. They were taught to feel the silence, to notice how emotions trembled in the air between people. Their teachers spoke not in words, but in light gestures, and the children answered with their eyes. To outsiders they would seem strange, a people of stone, cold and distant. but to each other they were radiant, alive with a kind of empathy the world has long forgotten. Their silence was not emptiness, it was harmony. The temples of resonance. Across the marble hills they built great halls that captured echoes, shaping them like clay. When an Elysaran entered one of these temples, their footsteps became part of a greater rhythm, soft, circular, like waves folding into themselves. These structures were carved with hollow veins and chambers that sang when the wind brushed through them. But the wind in Elysara rarely came. So the people themselves became the wind. They moved through the temples in graceful procession, their steps measured, their breaths synchronized. Their bodies were music, their silence the score. Once each cycle of the moon, the whole kingdom gathered at the grand hall of still waters. 1,000 citizens would stand around a wide silver pool. No one spoke, no one moved. They simply stood together, gazing into the reflection of the stars. And in that reflection, each person saw not themselves, but all of Elysara. They believed that every living soul was part of a single, endless silence. The pool, it was said, remembered every gaze. Even centuries later, when no one stood before it, the water shimmered faintly with ghostly faces, as though the silence itself refused to forget. The silent scholars. Knowledge in Elysara was kept not in books, but in memory. Their scholars, known as the keepers of thought, could recall entire histories, each detail stored like crystal within their minds. They gathered in the twilight chambers, rooms filled with thin streams of silver mist. Within that haze, their minds would link, their memories merging into a single tapestry of understanding. They needed no ink, no parchment, no speech. Their ideas flowed directly from heart to heart. It was said that if you listened closely, you could feel their thoughts vibrating faintly through the stones of the city, an unending murmur, silent yet alive. Many believed this was how the Elysarans achieved peace for so long. When no one spoke, no lies could be told. When all hearts were connected, no hatred could grow unnoticed. It was a fragile balance, but a beautiful one. The pain of sound. There was, however, one rule in Elysara that could never be broken. No sound of anger, grief, or violence could ever be made within the kingdom's borders. It was said that the air itself would tremble and punish those who shattered its calm. One ancient tablet, later found by wandering scholars, described what happened when a child once screamed in fear. The sky grew dark, the river turned still, and every echo in the valley fell silent for 7 days. From then on, the people treated sound like sacred fire, powerful, beautiful, and dangerous. The dance of days. Without speech, time moved differently in Elysara. The people marked seasons not by words, but by rhythm, by the slow dance of shadow and light across their marble streets. Each dawn, when the mist began to glow, the citizens would emerge from their homes and stand together at the hilltops. They faced the east, where the hidden sun breathed its first faint color into the fog. And though no one sang, the air seemed to hum.
It was the hum of thousands breathing in unison, the quietest chorus the world has ever known. At dusk, they would gather again, each family lighting a single lantern. The lanterns floated into the mist, carried by invisible air, and vanished without sound. To outsiders, it might look like a ritual of mourning. To the Elysarans, it was gratitude, a thank you to the silence that held their world together. The visitors who could not stay. Once, long ago, a group of travelers from the outer lands stumbled upon Elysara. They came seeking refuge after war had ravaged their homeland. The Elysarans welcomed them kindly, offering food, rest, and peace. But after only a few days, the travelers grew restless. They whispered to one another, unable to bear the weight of quiet. They laughed too loudly, spoke too quickly, and slowly the air began to change. Their voices echoed strangely, twisting and stretching as if the valley itself rejected them. Their laughter turned hollow, their words faded before they reached the ear. When they fled, their tongues felt heavy, their voices faint. None ever spoke again. Those who met them later said their eyes carried the stillness of another world, deep, endless, and full of forgotten echoes. The stillborn kings. Over the centuries, Elysara's rulers came and went, but none were remembered by name. The Elysarans had no kings in the way the world understands. Each generation chose a guardian, not to rule, but to listen. A guardian's duty was to preserve balance, to ensure that silence remained unbroken, that the world within stayed untouched by the noise beyond. They ruled not with commands, but with gestures. When a guardian lifted their hand, the entire valley bowed its head. When they lowered it, the air itself seemed to sigh. There was one law carved upon the gate of marble. He who speaks shatters eternity. It was a warning and a prophecy. The boundaries of the mist. The mist surrounding Elysara was not merely weather, it was alive, an ancient boundary woven by the will of the people. Those who entered it uninvited felt their minds blur, their memories fade. Those who belonged within could walk freely, guided by instinct and trust. At night, the mist glowed faintly with threads of light, the remnants of unspoken prayers drifting across the valley. Children would chase these glowing trails, laughing without sound, their movements graceful and weightless. The elders watched with serene pride, knowing that each generation would inherit the same vow, to live gently within the silence. The burden of perfection. But peace, even the quietest kind, carries weight. Generations of silence began to press upon the hearts of the young. There were some who wondered what a voice might sound like, who dreamed of thunder, of laughter, of music. At first, they kept their dreams hidden. But dreams are patient. They wait. And in Elysara, even silence has ears. A story began to pass through the hearts of the restless, of a time long before the vow, when the world was alive with sound. They imagined oceans roaring, trees whispering, rain singing against rooftops. They longed to hear it once, just once, before returning to stillness. But they could not. The vow was absolute.
And so they turned their longing inward, into art, into movement, into the subtle rhythm of breathing together. Still, deep in the mist, something had begun to stir. The dream that broke the calm. One night, the grand pool of reflection began to ripple. There was no wind, no tremor, no reason, but the water shivered, softly at first, then violently, as if trying to speak. The keepers of thought gathered, their faces pale. They could feel it, a pulse in the air, a sound trying to be born. It came from nowhere and from everyone at once. The silence was no longer content to remain unbroken. Something within it was awakening, a voice long buried, calling gently from beneath the surface of eternity. Thus ended the age of perfect stillness, and began the first tremor of change. The kingdom had endured centuries without a single sound, yet the quiet itself was beginning to dream. And in that dream, a whisper formed. Not of fear, not of anger, but of something far more dangerous. Curiosity. Before the kingdoms of men learned to carve their names into stone, the sun rose once more above the valley of Elysara. The fog thinned, and the light touched the hills like a painter laying the first brush of gold across an untouched canvas. The world seemed to wake in slow motion. Each marble ridge caught the pale glow and sent it wandering down into the folds of the valley, soft, quiet, endless. For the first time in many seasons, color moved through the mist. The people emerged from their dwellings of white stone, barefoot and calm, their robes flowing with the same rhythm as the morning light. They gathered on the terraces that circled the city, gazing upward in reverence. No sound passed between them, yet a single thought drifted through every mind. The dawn remembers us. The evening silence. When the sun finally sank behind the western peaks, the marble hills turned lavender, then silver, then ghost white. One by one, lanterns were lit, not with flame, but with small orbs of captured starlight that glowed softly in the mist. The citizens gathered again in the open plazas. They sat upon the stone steps, their faces serene, their hands folded in quiet repose. The air cooled, and for a long while, nothing moved. Then, as the first star appeared, the valley exhaled. A faint pulse moved through the city, a silent wave of contentment. It passed from heart to heart until even the stones seemed to sigh. No words were spoken. None were needed. The day had been lived in perfect stillness. The eternal observation. Far above, on the highest hill, the guardian of that age stood alone. Her name is lost now, but her presence remained etched into the memory of the land. She gazed over the marble terraces, the glowing lake, the unbroken calm, and wondered, not in fear, but in curiosity, how long such perfection could last. The stars answered only with their patient shimmer. In that moment, the guardian felt a strange tug in her heart, as though the silence itself was holding its breath. She turned her face to the horizon, where the fog thickened once more, hiding whatever lay beyond. She felt something waiting there, an echo yet to come. Thus ended the first recorded day of Elysara's golden age. The dawn had blessed the marble hills, the people had kept their vow, and the silence remained whole. But beneath that flawless calm, time was gathering its own quiet storm. Somewhere beyond the mist, destiny was stirring, softly, patiently, waiting for the moment when silence would hear its own heartbeat and wonder what it meant. A faint hum of wind through stone, soft low strings in the distance. In the age when silence first became law, a new calling stirred within the hearts of Elysara's dreamers. They were not warriors nor priests. They were listeners of stone, men and women who claimed that marble could hear. They gathered in a hollow at the edge of the valley where the mists touched the mountains. There, the earth trembled with a quiet so deep that one could feel the pulse of the world beneath bare feet. The builders knelt and pressed their palms to the ground, waiting for its breath. When they rose, they knew their purpose. They would build the kingdom of voice that could speak without sound. Each artisan chose a single element to serve for life. Some devoted themselves to light, learning how it bent and lingered. Others to air, tracing the invisible paths of wind that never reached the valley. A few to stone, memorizing its hidden vibrations. And one order, the most secret, studied memory, believing even silence could be carved. Their craft was not construction as we know it. They shaped the world as a musician shapes a song, pausing often, listening, waiting for the right stillness to return before striking again. They worked through the long, muted seasons. When mist fell, they labored by touch alone, guided by the hum beneath their hands. When the sun appeared, they rested, for too much brightness broke the delicate calm of their focus. Bit by bit, the first temples of stillness began to rise. Structures that did not disturb the air, but seemed to grow naturally from it. Pillars curved like frozen waves. Ceilings floated on arches so fine that they disappeared in the fog. Inside, nothing echoed. Even a footstep dissolved before it could reach the ear. The people watched in reverent awe. It was said that if you stood within one of those halls and closed your eyes, you could feel the pulse of the valley beating in rhythm with your own heart. When the first temple was complete, the architects gathered to test its harmony. They entered at twilight, carrying no tools, no light, only the memory of the vow that bound their kingdom. At the center stood a vast circle of smooth stone, the resonant floor. Each artisan placed a hand upon it and exhaled. The air trembled, faintly at first, then more strongly, until the entire hall began to hum with a tone too deep for sound. It was silence singing. From that moment, the architects were changed. They realized that their craft could reach beyond marble and air, that by shaping stillness, they could shape thought. They built bridges that whispered calm into the minds of those who crossed them. They raised arches that cooled the temper of anyone who passed beneath. Even the smallest courtyard fountain seemed to slow the heart, teaching the body to breathe as softly as the mist itself. In time, the city became a living instrument of serenity. Travelers who entered it felt their words die on their tongues, replaced by a vast peace that was neither joy nor sorrow. The silence of Elysara was complete. Yet, among the architects, a question began to rise, soft as a feather, dangerous as fire. Could silence be built too perfectly? Could peace, once absolute, begin to smother the very life it sought to protect? The eldest of the order, Master Saren, pondered this question alone for many years. He wandered through the empty corridors of his creations, listening to the faint heartbeat of stone. Sometimes he thought he heard replies, gentle murmurs in the marble, as if the city itself had begun to dream. One evening, while the valley slept, Saren climbed the highest terrace of the great hall. The fog lay beneath him like an ocean. He closed his eyes and spoke, not aloud, but within his mind. If silence is perfect, will it still know how to live? For the first time, the stone answered. A tremor passed through the pillars, light as breath. He felt warmth spread through his fingers and down into the earth. The city was listening. When dawn came, a new pattern appeared across the marble hills, tiny cracks forming spirals, like frost on glass. The architects saw them and fell to their knees in awe. The land had spoken back. From then on, every new temple was built with a single, deliberate flaw, a small imperfection to remind the people that even stillness must bend, that silence must breathe. They called these flaws the heart's echo. And though the people of Elysara never used words, every child grew up tracing those lines in the stone, feeling the faint hum that lived beneath. They did not know it, but in that gentle vibration slept the first seed of change, the whisper that one day would become a voice. There was a river that wound through the heart of Elysara, wide as a dream and silver as a blade of moonlight. The people never named it aloud, for they believed names carried sound, and sound might break its spell. Instead, they called it in their thoughts, the River of Memory.
It was said that every drop within it remembered something: a child's first breath, a storm that never came, a promise left unspoken. The water shimmered even in darkness, and when it touched the marble banks, faint images rippled across its surface. Faces, clouds, moments half remembered. At dusk, the citizens gathered in silence along its edge. They came not to pray, but to listen. No one truly heard words, but each heart seemed to catch fragments of its own story flowing by. A shepherd might see the outline of his lost lamb in the current. A mother might glimpse the color of her daughter's laughter. The river connected them all, a living thread of recollection that kept the still kingdom breathing. And yet, it also held secrets older than Elysara itself. Part 2. The Waters Beneath. Far beneath the surface, where the current thickened to mist, there was said to be another stream, one that ran backward toward the past. The scholars of Elysara built narrow bridges of glass to study it. When they leaned over, they saw not their reflections, but visions of the world before silence. They saw forests roaring with wind. They saw birds slicing the air with bright, living cries. And they saw the first ancestors of Elysara, people who spoke, argued, sang. The scholars trembled. Such noise felt violent, almost painful. They sealed their scrolls and never spoke of it again. But in the deepest cellars, a few continued to visit, drawn by curiosity more than fear. They began to record what they saw, not with ink, but with memory stones, small translucent crystals that captured thoughts as light. Years passed, and soon whole vaults of glowing stones filled the undertemples, pulsing gently like the heartbeats of the forgotten world. Those who touched them sometimes fell asleep for days, dreaming voices that no one else could hear. There was a river that wound through the heart of Elysara, wide as a dream and silver as a blade of moonlight. The people never named it aloud, for they believed names carried sound, and sound might break its spell. Instead, they called it in their thoughts, the River of Memory. It was said that every drop within it remembered something: a child's first breath, a storm that never came, a promise left unspoken. The water shimmered even in darkness, and when it touched the marble banks, faint images rippled across its surface, faces, clouds, moments half remembered. At dusk, the citizens gathered in silence along its edge. They came not to pray, but to listen. No one truly heard words, but each heart seemed to catch fragments of its own story flowing by. A shepherd might see the outline of his lost lamb in the current. A mother might glimpse the color of her daughter's laughter. The river connected them all, a living thread of recollection that kept the still kingdom breathing. And yet, it also held secrets older than Elysara itself. Part 2. The Waters Beneath. Far beneath the surface, where the current thickened to mist, there was said to be another stream, one that ran backward toward the past. The scholars of Elysara built narrow bridges of glass to study it. When they leaned over, they saw not their reflections, but visions of the world before silence. They saw forests roaring with wind. They saw birds slicing the air with bright, living cries. And they saw the first ancestors of Elysara, people who spoke, argued, sang. The scholars trembled. Such noise felt violent, almost painful. They sealed their scrolls and never spoke of it again. But in the deepest cellars, a few continued to visit, drawn by curiosity more than fear. They began to record what they saw, not with ink, but with memory stones, small translucent crystals that captured thoughts as light. Years passed, and soon whole vaults of glowing stones filled the undertemples, pulsing gently like the heartbeats of the forgotten world. Those who touched them sometimes fell asleep for days, dreaming voices that no one else could hear. There was a river that wound through the heart of Elysara, wide as a dream and silver as a blade of moonlight. The people never named it aloud, for they believed names carried sound, and sound might break its spell. Instead, they called it in their thoughts, the River of Memory. It was said that every drop within it remembered something: a child's first breath, a storm that never came, a promise left unspoken. The water shimmered even in darkness, and when it touched the marble banks, faint images rippled across its surface, faces, clouds, moments half remembered. At dusk, the citizens gathered in silence along its edge. They came not to pray, but to listen. No one truly heard words, but each heart seemed to catch fragments of its own story flowing by. A shepherd might see the outline of his lost lamb in the current. A mother might glimpse the color of her daughter's laughter. The river connected them all, a living thread of recollection that kept the still kingdom breathing. And yet, it also held secrets older than Elysara itself. Far beneath the surface, where the current thickened to mist, there was said to be another stream, one that ran backward toward the past. The scholars of Elysara built narrow bridges of glass to study it. When they leaned over, they saw not their reflections, but visions of the world before silence. They saw forests roaring with wind. They saw birds slicing the air with bright, living cries. And they saw the first ancestors of Elysara, people who spoke, argued, sang. The scholars trembled. Such noise felt violent, almost painful. They sealed their scrolls and never spoke of it again. But in the deepest cellars, a few continued to visit, drawn by curiosity more than fear. They began to record what they saw, not with ink, but with memory stones, small translucent crystals that captured thoughts as light. Years passed, and soon whole vaults of glowing stones filled the undertemples, pulsing gently like the heartbeats of the forgotten world. Those who touched them sometimes fell asleep for days, dreaming voices that no one else could hear. There was a river that wound through the heart of Elysara, wide as a dream and silver as a blade of moonlight. The people never named it aloud, for they believed names carried sound, and sound might break its spell. Instead, they called it in their thoughts, the River of Memory. It was said that every drop within it remembered something: a child's first breath, a storm that never came, a promise left unspoken. The water shimmered even in darkness, and when it touched the marble banks, faint images rippled across its surface, faces, clouds, moments half remembered. At dusk, the citizens gathered in silence along its edge. They came not to pray, but to listen. No one truly heard words, but each heart seemed to catch fragments of its own story flowing by. A shepherd might see the outline of his lost lamb in the current. A mother might glimpse the color of her daughter's laughter. The river connected them all, a living thread of recollection that kept the still kingdom breathing. And yet, it also held secrets older than Elysara itself. Far beneath the surface, where the current thickened to mist, there was said to be another stream, one that ran backward toward the past. The scholars of Elysara built narrow bridges of glass to study it. When they leaned over, they saw not their reflections, but visions of the world before silence. They saw forests roaring with wind. They saw birds slicing the air with bright, living cries. And they saw the first ancestors of Elysara, people who spoke, argued, sang. The scholars trembled. Such noise felt violent, almost painful. They sealed their scrolls and never spoke of it again. But in the deepest cellars, a few continued to visit, drawn by curiosity more than fear. They began to record what they saw, not with ink, but with memory stones, small translucent crystals that captured thoughts as light. Years passed, and soon whole vaults of glowing stones filled the undertemples, pulsing gently like the heartbeats of the forgotten world. Those who touched them sometimes fell asleep for days, dreaming voices that no one else could hear. Long after the architects had shaped the stillness, and the river of memory had learned to dream, a new figure arose in Elysara, Queen Elora. She was not born to rule, she was born to listen. It was said she could feel the mood of the kingdom through the soles of her feet, the way others felt rain upon their skin. Her palace was unlike any other, open to the air, built without doors, for she believed silence must never be trapped. Each morning she walked barefoot through the marble corridors, trailing her fingers across the walls as though reading the kingdom's pulse. Her people adored her quiet strength. But in Elora's dreams, there was always the same image: a single drop of water falling into a pool, and the faint echo of a word she could almost remember: the burden of stillness. Elysara had known centuries of peace. No voice had broken the air since the founding vows were made. The crops grew, the river shimmered, the people lived in perfect order, and yet something in that perfection began to weigh upon them. The silence that once felt sacred now grew heavy. Parents found themselves watching their children in fear, as if sound might slip from their mouth like a curse. Even laughter had become forbidden, not by law, but by habit. Elora saw it. She watched her people walk with bowed heads, their gestures slower each year. Their dreams, once bright, began to fade into gray mist. The river whispered louder now, carrying memories she could not understand. The night of the word. On the eve of the longest night, Elora climbed the steps of the Tower of Still Air, the highest point in her kingdom. From there, she could see the mist rolling like oceans around the marble hills. She closed her eyes and felt the silence pressing in, vast and suffocating. In her heart, she knew silence had turned from blessing to prison. Her people had forgotten how to feel. And then, from somewhere deep within, she remembered the dream. The drop of water, the word unspoken. It rose to her lips, trembling, fragile. She whispered it. Live. The sound was softer than breath, lighter than dew, yet it rippled through the kingdom like a pulse through water. Birds startled from the forests beyond. The river of memory flashed silver blue. Every citizen of Elysara lifted their head at once, hearts thundering with something they had never known: the echo of a voice. The price of sound. At dawn, the mists were different. They moved. Winds began to stir for the first time in 1,000 years, sighing through the marble streets.
But the stillness that had guarded Elysara began to unravel. Walls cracked. Echoes awoke. The sacred silence, once perfect, had been broken, and it could not return. Elora stood upon her balcony and watched the city tremble under the weight of new sound. She felt sorrow, and yet relief too. Her whisper had freed them. Before sunset, the queen vanished. Some said the river took her. Others believed she became part of the wind, the first sound Elysara ever heard, and the last to fade. But from that day forward, every night breeze that passed through the valley carried her word. If you listen closely, even now, you might hear it between your own breaths. Live.